Good afternoon to all of you. We are going to start this session about Habitat 3. This is an introductory session on this important conference that is going to take place in 2016. Myself, I'm the Director of Research of UN Habitat and Capacity Development. And today we have with us a representative from the government of St. Petersburg, and Eugenie, who is part of the global campaign of UN Habitat and the World, and who is also professor in the university. And the idea of this presentation is to give a highlight of the most important features and conditions of this conference, and from there to engage with you in some level of questions and answers on how do you foresee the conference, what do you expect from it, how it's going to be organized, and which are the outcomes. Let me start with a brief presentation. We can start with the time. I'm going to take 10 minutes from this, I hope. Just to remind you first, Habitat 3 is not a conference of UN Habitat. It's a conference of the UN system at large. It's a conference that takes place every 20 years. And some of the important highlights of this conference in this historic perspective are the following. Number one, it's in Vancouver, where the first Habitat 1 took place nearly 40 years ago. Something interesting is that cities and urbanization was perceived as detrimental for environmental development. And then the idea was to control urbanization. In '96, 20 years later, there was a big shift in the paradigm and the understanding of role of cities. And then we see that for the first time, cities were perceived as the engines of growth and development. 2000, the International Development Agenda through the Millennium Development Goals introduced to the notion of poverty and environmental sustainability as fundamental conditions for sustainable development. Habitat, in the Millennium Summit, some of these fundamental principles were reaffirmed, and 2-3 years ago, the Rio Plus 20 conference give a big boost, we will say, to urbanization and cities, mentioning that cities are where the fight against sustainable urbanization and development at large will take place, and where urbanization and sustainability are extremely connected, I would say also for the first time. Post-2015, which is the agenda that is being discussed today at the end of the Millennium Development Goals, is opening room. It's a proposed goal on city development, which is extremely important for us. I would like to do a brief review of what has changed in these 20 years. Some of them are facts, others are more policies, and others are more process-oriented changes. The first one, as you can see here, in Habitat 2, the urban population of the world was 2.6 billion, and we moved to 4 billion, an increase in 20 years or 1.4 billion. Interesting to note of this increase is that 1.3 billion took place in the developing world, and only 120 million in the developed world. In other words, the developing world in the last 20 years grew on average 13 times faster than the developed world. And another interesting thing to see here is that Asia concentrated 900 million of these 1.4. Second interesting thing on urbanization is that the level of urbanization moved from 45% in Habitat 2 to 54% is going to be in 2016, which represents an increase of level of urbanization of around 10%. The urban growth, unlike what many studies and people are saying, has not been unprecedentedly increasing. On the contrary, it shows a slow decline. And a slow decline that moved from 2.4 nearly to 2%. And this decline, which represents 12% at the global level of urbanization, was mainly concentrated in Asia, that reduced 20% the rate of growth, and in Latin America that reduced minus 44% of this growth. Another interesting change in these years has to do with the level of development of cities. If you look at cities of more than 1 million inhabitants, in 96, in Habitat 2, there were only 269 cities of more than 1 million inhabitants. By 2060, there are going to be 428 cities, which represents an increase of 160 cities nearly. Interesting again is that from these 160 cities, 151, 93%, 94, are cities from the developing world. In 20 years, cities from the developed world saw only the emergence of 8 cities. Not only that, in these 20 years, for instance, in Europe, half of the cities of Europe saw a shrinking population. What has changed from the substantive point of view, which is not numbers, but I would say ideas, principles, and process-oriented changes? The first one is that in Habitat 2, UN Habitat published the report of the conference that was called "The World is Urbanizing." Today, the world continues to urbanize, but has already urbanized. As I said, 96, when you read documents from 96, there was a clear connection between urbanization and environmental degradation. Urbanization is bad for the environment. Today, UN Habitat and partners believe that the transformative power of urbanization can produce sustainable cities and sustainable environments. Remember that in Habitat 2, there was endorsed by all member states the Habitat Agenda document. This Habitat Agenda document has 2 fundamental characteristics. The first one is something like 92 different themes. It was an all-encompassing agenda, and we would like to move today with the new urban agenda that we hope is going to be adopted in 2016 to key fundamental issues of development. Second one, because of these 92-something sectoral approaches, it was extremely difficult to understand urbanization in an integrated manner. It remains in these 20 years very sectoral. Today, we would like to make a qualitative jump to citywide development, approach of development that is holistic and integrated. Some of the political changes. 96, again, there was endorsed 2 goals for the Habitat Agenda. One was called the Sustainable Urban Settlement Goal. Today, we are moving from a specific goal to the idea that the new urban agenda should clearly connect sustainable urban development with sustainable development. The equation is clear. We are discussing sustainable development. Cities need to be the engine for that change. 96, if you read the Habitat Agenda document, inequality features only once in the whole document. If you do track changes, search, only once. Today, the Habitat 3 agenda would like to make inequality, poverty, and inclusion fundamental aspects of development. 96, gender was importantly mentioned, but always, again, in a very sectoral way. And with the idea that gender should be integrated with institutional binding. Today, gender is part of the mainstreaming agenda, is part of the fundamental bold aspects of urbanization. Another important change is that the notion of human rights. Human rights in 96 were referred to notions like freedoms, poverty, participation, the right to not suffer from unlawful evictions, etc. Now, it's a fundamental change in this principle, because what we are looking is the idea that we should have a human right-based approach to urbanization. A human-based rights approach that looks again in an integrated manner to different aspects of human rights. Political changes. 96, with this notion of enabling environments, created conditions for the deregulation of the market. The participation of different actors, private sector was obviously positive, But this transformation lead to the idea that countries should, and principally states, should retreat from development and to leave other actors to participate. We believe that in 2016, we need to come back to discussions, important discussions, on regulatory mechanisms and a strong state and strong institutions. 20 years ago, migration was considered bad. Migration was part of an evil aspect of urbanization. We believe and we conceptualize today migration with other multilateral organizations and bilateral as part of a process that is fundamental for poverty reduction, not only in urban but also in rural areas. This mobility is fundamental, is a human right of rural and urban populations, and is a precondition for sustainable development. Next one is a very interesting one. In '96, when you read documents, policies, reports from government, urbanization and the city was considered as sort of a platform, a place where actions were taking place, a place where you will dump, if may I say, or put in this table or platform some specific actions. Today, there is a fundamental shift in this notion, and urbanization is not only any longer a platform, it is a vector of change. Urbanization, well done, well planned, is a fundamental vehicle to achieve other sustainable development goals. 20 years ago, it was clear that the agenda was an agenda for the South. We would like that this agenda of 2016 is for the whole world. And we would like to move from being the last of the conference cycle to be the beginning of the 2015, and also to have a fundamental legacy, which is the adoption of a new urban agenda that we are going to discuss some of these elements. I have a few minutes to conclude, and I would like to say that which are some of the fundamental changes of this year. 20 years ago, when you look at the typology of cities, small, medium, large, no one considered that mega regions, urban corridors, city regions would emerge. A completely different geography of development that entails also a completely geography of governance in cities and countries. 20 years ago is not as clear as today that cities are the place where you can claim human rights, but where you can also fight for these human rights, are the stages of this protest and other important issues associated to social transformative changes. Housing 20 years ago was considered the vehicle, was considered the agent of economic development and transformation. But what we have seen is that housing, with these bubbles and with these policies, has become also not only a productive, but also a speculative asset. And housing and planning need to be reconceptualized in this new urban agenda. And obviously, a fundamental change is that cities have become key players in the global arena. Because of this, we would like to say that this new urban agenda should address 3 or 4 fundamental challenges and opportunities. One is that cities have an unsustainable model of urbanization that has created cities to grow 3 times more physically than what they needed, that have created cities that if you compare 20 years ago to today, 75% of cities are more unequal today than they were 20 years ago. We need to respond to these challenges. We need to respond to the still increasing slum dwellers agenda, obviously the climate change, and the problems of cities. In conclusion, and I'm going to give the floor to the speakers, today things have changed dramatically. We have new forces, new powers, new actors, new challenges, and new opportunities. And all this is clearly claiming for a new global urban agenda, and Habitat 3 is what is going to discuss. Thank you very much. Because of time, I would like to skip this and to tell you that speakers will now address different issues related to this. We are going to follow I'm going to ask first Eugenie not only because it's a lady, but which is by itself extremely important, but also because she's going to start speaking of what is the role of universities, of the academic world, and also civil society in the new urban agenda. And then we are going to move to the representative of St. Petersburg government, who is going to speak about the role of governments, the role of subnational governments. And finally, we are going to have Jaramillo from the city of Medellín, who is going to present to us the connection between the World Urban Forum that was recently held in Medellín to Habitat 3, and what an important city like Medellín, an innovative city, the role that can play on this. Thank you very much.
How do I get my presentation?
It's coming by itself.
Thank you very much, Eduardo, for that phenomenal presentation. As you know, the title of this session is Gathering and Analyzing Urban Data towards Habitat 3, what sort of engagement we will need to have as we think about the new urban agenda, as Eduardo has so brilliantly presented. I think we need to look back and see what we did in the past. You've just heard about the various Habitat conferences that were held in 1976 and the documents that came out of them. These are just some images so you can imagine what was happening there. In 1976, everyone went to Vancouver. That was a time when only 37% of the world was urban, and that was only 1.5 billion people. Fast forward to 1996 when we create the Habitat Agenda, as explained by Eduardo. By that time, 45% urban, as he mentioned, and that was 2.6 billion people. Here we are now in 2016, or about to be now in 2016, nearing 4 billion people and thinking about a new urban agenda. How will this new urban agenda be created? It will be created from us. It will be created by all of those stakeholders who have something to say and contribute points of views and knowledge to how we might think about how cities will be organized in the future. This means the public sector, it means national, regional, and local governments who will be driving the programs and policies, but it also means the voices of civil society. Civil society representatives from grassroots organizations, women's organizations, academia, trade unions, from professionals and private sector and foundations. The media has a role in this too. But where does urban data come into this? It will come into this as we think about the, hopefully to be passed, the SDG on cities. The SDG on cities as it reads now, and there will be a discussion in the next year as the General Assembly decides what it will do with these SDGs, but we hope you will all lobby for this one. It says, make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. Very nice aspirational idea. That's the goal, but we have to have some targets towards that, and they are there in these various areas, as you can see, from housing, transport, open space, environment, heritage, planning, and resilience. And we need to measure those targets as we go forward. And this framework should, of course, underlie what might come out of the new urban agenda. Now, what are the kinds of measurements that we have? We have traditional census data, which we'll talk about in a second. We have growing international standards for thinking about how you view cities in general, and we have this phenomenal field of spatial analysis which will join with the census material to help us understand where we're going. But we have to translate all of this into messages that people understand. Traditional census is based on what national governments collect. They had their own standards for how they define urban. So when we see something like this, which is the World Urbanization Prospects, which tells you how many places are urban, what % they're urban, and so forth, we will see that that's how they came up with that data of 54% urban today. But just take a look at these definitions about what people count as urban. They vary all over the place. In the United Kingdom, you have to have 10,000 people in a place before you're thought to be urban. India, 5,000. Nigeria, 20,000. And in the United States, 2,500. So remember, the basis for the collection of this data is a little wobbly, but we accept it because this is what we have, and we hope in the future we will find ways to create better mechanisms for collecting this data now that we're in the world of big data. And what we need to collect is sub-national data, not just national data. Boundaries make a huge difference when you're collecting this data. We'll take this example of Chongqing in China, largest city in the world, 34 million people. However, its 32,000 square miles include a good deal, as you can see, a good deal of agricultural land, as well as that downtown, that central city of 7 million people. So when we hear 34 million people, we shake our heads and say, wow, but when we look at the map and we see what this is, we can see that there's some distinctions here that we need to understand as we try to reconcile an uniform way of collecting data. Management counts. You heard how growth is going to occur in the developing world, and these are places that, by and large, have less capacity to collect data as they've been collected in the developed world. Let's take a look at India. India has very stringent definitions of urban. They've not updated this for 50 years, and if you look at the box in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see you have to have a population of 5,000 or more, and it has to be a density of 1,000 per square mile. And here's an interesting wrinkle. 75% of the workers in this place that's going to be called urban have to be in non-agricultural employment, and they have to be men, okay? So that's the Indian definition of urban. We need to do some work, as you can see. So we do have the possibility, and I'm sure you've been hearing about this everywhere in dealing with how we can collect these things. We can also think about national ways or international ways of measuring urban so that we can compare across countries. Eduardo Moreno here is the brilliant creator of something called the City Prosperity Index. He takes 5 indices with various pieces of data and comes up with a way of looking at cities that goes well beyond the typical GDP measurements. We know that we can measure prosperity in many ways, and this is a very, very good way of thinking about this. There are the problems, however, that I mentioned, and you just saw them as we went through them with the national data collection. We need to really work hard in finding better ways to collect data. Currently, there's another international standard that has just emerged, the ISO 37120, which basically looks at city services, 21 core indicators. This is the list of the group that's there. I'd bring to your attention, nothing is perfect here. For urban planning, the core indicator is the amount of green area per 100,000 per square mile. Now, to me, that's all very nice, but that's not urban planning. So we need to think about how we can improve these kinds of standards as well. The very exciting area, of course, happening is the advances in spatial analysis, and we're in the right place to talk about that. There are over 1,000 satellites whirling around the world today, and there are many, many countries that are engaging not only in basic research around looking at what they're gathering from the satellite information, but more important for our purposes today, looking at what's happening with land cover and urban growth. And there's been great improvements. 1957 was Sputnik. 1972 was Landsat, was the first satellite that was beginning to look at what the land cover was like. And the resolution you can see at the top was a little blurry. We're looking at Delhi. And by 2012, we launched another one, another Landsat satellite, which greatly improved the resolution and what you're measuring. Why would you want to measure these things? Because when we're talking about sustainable urbanization, we're certainly talking about how much land is consumed by cities as they grow. We could talk also about how we manage cities with data, but I'm not going to go down that road. You just go out into this exhibit and you can see in spades how we can do that. There are many others who are working on this issue of land expansion and population. The German Aerospace Center is launching something called the Global Urban Footprint, which will give us very, very good data. We're looking again at Delhi, and we're looking at 3 grades of color, gray, black, and white. The black, of course, is urban, the gray is in between, and the white is rural, but it gives you a very good way of seeing what's happening with these land patterns. And indeed, the Global Human Settlements Layer, which is being done by the Joint Research Center in experimental stages right now, will bring us down to very, very close resolutions very small resolutions and understanding what's happening with growth, and they're going to overlay that with population data. So we're going to be able to see where people are living with regard to how much land they're taking up. So as we go forward in thinking about how we're going to create a new urban agenda, of course we have to voice our views and opinions, but it would really be good if we could voice those views and opinions based on some evidence, based on some views about what sustainable urbanization is. On the left, and you're looking at a piece of work done by Solly Angel, which is showing land expansion, and I'm not going to name the place, it doesn't matter, because every map that he's done would look like this. Population increased in this period in 15 years by 50%, land cover by 153%. So why should we care? We care because look where that land cover is. If we had a little higher resolution, which we'll get when the Germans come in and the Europeans come in, we would see that this land cover is taking up fertile farming land. This land cover, built environment that is taking up areas that shouldn't be built on the coast. We know what that means. We've all experienced the hurricanes and floods and so forth. We have the tools in front of us to employ and to improve, to inform our decision makers and our stakeholders about what should go into this new urban agenda. But they're not perfect. They need a tremendous lot of work. We need to go back to our own countries and stamp our pretty little feet and say, let's get some more intelligent ways of looking at what's happening to urban development and growth. Let's have some smarter ways of looking at what's happening to how we manage urban growth. Let's come up with a new urban agenda that's not platitudes, but it is something that is sensible, focused, evidence-based, and will mean something in the next 20 years. Why do we want it to mean something in the next 20 years? Because demographers have told us that by 2050, we need to build the equivalent, listen to this, the equivalent of a city of 1 million every week for the next 40 years. A city of 1 million every week for the next 40 years. What are these cities going to look like, and how are they going to behave? It's in our power to determine this. We must grasp this power, because after all, cities produce today 70 to 80% of the global GDP. Cities are 54 and will go to 66% of the population. They will continue to produce this GDP. They also produce 70 to 80% of the greenhouse gas consumption based on their energy consumption, which is approximately the same amount. But they do it on a lower per capita basis. So we have a lot of promise here with being able to create sustainable urbanization if we get the right numbers, the right data, the right means to analyze that, and translate that into plain English or plain Spanish or plain whatever language we're speaking, so that our decision makers know how important it is to support sustainable urbanization. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you to Eugenie Birch from Penn University for this excellent presentation. She kept perfectly the time, but she did something very interesting to me, is to recall all of us that the new urban agenda that is going to be discussed and is going to shape the future of urbanization in the next 20 years is not only a political agenda. It's also and should be fundamentally a technically empirically based agenda. And for that, she's recalling us that we need serious techniques, serious information, but we need also to equip governments at different levels to produce the data that is required in order to substantiate policy making. She also is telling us, and this is a very important thing for Habitat as well, that we need to look at monitoring sustainable tools of monitoring of urbanization in a more integrated manner of the different initiatives that are taking place today in the world. Thank you, Eugene, for this excellent presentation. I would like to give the floor to Mr. Oleg Rybin, who is the chairman of Committee for Urban Development and Architecture and chief architect from the city of St. Petersburg. Mr. Oleg is going to have a simultaneous translation from Russian to English. Mr. Oleg, you have 12 minutes. Please, go ahead.
Спасибо. Выступающие коллеги очень верно обозначили вектор сбора информации. Статистика – вещь упрямая, и в этом смысле точные данные, на которых мы будем основывать свои прогнозы и будущее своих земель, городов и поселений, это очень важно.
Our colleague spoke very well. Do you hear me? Our colleague spoke very well about the statistics. Statistics and data is a very important factor that we must base our policies on in order to improve our sustainable urbanization.
Это своего рода замеры и диагностика организма. Будь это маленький город, будь это город больше миллиона жителей или это целый регион.
It can be a small city, it can be a medium city, it can be a big city, more than 1 million population, but it's like a diagnostic of a body in the medicine.
Здесь также говорилось о переписи населения как важнейшей составляющей вот этих замеров.
We also heard about census, that census is a very important source of data.
Последняя перепись населения в России показывает нам, по сути, 4 точки роста населения при общей динамике.
The last census in Russia indicates 4 main points of growth of population.
При общей положительной демографической ситуации
The general demographic situation is positive in Russia.
мы наблюдаем рост городов в Москве, Санкт-Петербурге,
But now we observe a big growth of such cities as Moscow, St. Petersburg,
нефтедобывающих регионов Сибири
and oil extracting regions of Siberia
и Северный Кавказ.
and northern Caucasus.
И, пожалуй, только на Северном Кавказе это естественный прирост, а не механический.
And we can only speak about natural growth of population in the northern Caucasus.
Что можно сделать в данном случае, если мы говорим о полицентризме развития территорий всей страны?
If we want to speak about polycentrical approach of development of all the country,
бурный рост мегаполисов не только Москвы и Петербурга, но и миллионников, их 12.
we observe a very dynamic growth of big cities such as Moscow, St. Petersburg and other 1 million cities that we have 12 cities like this in Russia.
Безусловно, основан на тех самых факторах, о которых говорили коллеги. Это либеральная миграция,
And this growth has to do with those factors that we heard from our colleagues. It's free migration.
это опережающий рост городов, а не малых городов или деревень.
It's a overgrowing
Больших городов, да.
growth of big cities and not of small cities and small villages.
Но успеваем ли мы за этим ростом и успевает ли инфраструктура городов обеспечивать этот рост?
But the question is, if the infrastructure of the cities and towns can keep up with the rhythm, with the rate of this growth.
И здесь надо отметить, что система расселения и именно строительство жилья
And here we must say that the system of settlement and housing construction,
которая, в общем, во всем мире является уже неким отдельным бизнесом.
is a separate, is a standalone business in the whole world.
Когда привлекательность города привлекает девелоперов в эти города, и они приходят строить жилье без особых обоснований, а где эти люди будут работать.
If a city is attractive for developers, they come to the city, then begin to construct housing there without taking into account where will work all these people.
Хотя, естественно, и понятно, что большой город является самим местом приложения труда.
Yes, we also understand that in a big city, people always can find work.
Но когда инфраструктура не успевает за строительством больших миллионных жилых образований,
But when the infrastructure can't keep up with the growth of big cities,
то мы получаем коллапс транспортной системы.
then we have a collapse of the transportation system.
Это прекрасно видно на примере Москвы, Санкт-Петербурга и других городов-миллионников.
And we perfectly well can see it in Moscow, St. Petersburg and other more than 1 million cities in Russia.
Но эти процессы и также влияют и на малые города.
But all these processes are also applicable to the small cities.
В малых городах жить некому, а в больших жить невозможно.
We have no people to live in small cities, and it's impossible to live in big cities.
И вот наша основная задача найти этот баланс.
So our main challenge is to find the balance,
Когда большая территория страны
because our country has a very big territory.
Должна быть все-таки полицентричным развитием, и это самая главная задача нахождения этого баланса.
And the urbanization of this territory must be balanced. So our main challenge is to find this balance of this polycentrical model of growth.
Поэтому нацеленность правительства России на нахождение точек роста на Дальнем Востоке, в Сибири.
That's why Russian government is looking now for new points of growth in Far East, in Siberia.
А не только в европейской части, является основной задачей.
And not only in the European part of Russia, it's their main challenge now.
Санкт-Петербург – единственный северный город на этой широте, который составляет более 5 миллионов человек.
Nowadays, St. Petersburg is the only big city on this latitude, such a Nordic latitude, with 5 million people.
И в прогнозе до 2020 года, скорее всего, это будет 6 миллионов.
And our forecast for 2020 is that we will have 6 million people in St. Petersburg.
Любые северные города гораздо более компактные и меньше по численности.
Normally, all the northern cities are much smaller and much less population.
Естественно, это ставит перед нами задачи нахождения какого-то особенного пути для этого крупного города на севере.
So now our challenge is to find a new approach and specific model of development of growth of this big city in the north.
И полицентризм внутри агломерации ставит перед нами совершенно другие задачи.
And we also observe polycentrism, the polycentrical model inside our agglomeration.
И это не только полицентризм экономических точек роста, но и объектов историко-культурного наследия.
And I'm not only speaking about diversity and polycentrical model of economical points, economical factors, but also about heritage.
Потому что Петербург это не только центр, но еще и огромные другие образования вокруг. Это Петергоф, Выборг, Шлиссельбург.
Because St. Petersburg is composed the heritage of St. Petersburg, the historical legacy of St. Petersburg doesn't only include the downtown, the center of the city, but also include different suburban areas like Petersburg, Pushkin, Pavlovsk, etc.
Но именно территория самого большого исторического центра, по мнению экспертов ЮНЕСКО, Петербург является одним из сложных объектов ЮНЕСКО.
That's why the UNESCO experts consider St. Petersburg as one of the most complex and difficult legacies of UNESCO.
Сложных в управлении.
And very difficult to manage.
И это тоже те же самые жилые образования и люди, которые живут в коммунальных квартирах в центре города.
Because now in the downtown, in the center of the city, we have people sharing one flat.
И чтобы обеспечить вот этот полицентризм, безусловно, и Москва, и Петербург выходят с инициативой не только делать генеральные мастер-планы и генеральные планы на города.
And in order to assure this polycentrical model, Moscow and St. Petersburg now have initiatives not only to build more areas and new cities,
но и смотреть их в разрезе агломерации.
But also look at them at the whole.
И это сейчас самое главное – найти пути развития и найти пути перезагрузки малых городов Ленинградской области.
So for us, the most important point now is to reset to this development of these small suburban cities and villages of St. Petersburg area.
И тогда эта полноценная модель полицентричного региона будет работать, на наш взгляд, более полноценно.
Then we will have a holistic and well-working polycentrical model of St. Petersburg region.
Спасибо.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Oleg. If you notice a presentation about St. Petersburg and the Russian cities, but it has a lot of commonalities with many cities of the world. And I think that this helps us to delineate the contours of the new urban agenda. Let me highlight some of them. For instance, the challenge of creation of a system of cities, cities of different sizes, responding to the development needs and plans of the country. Second, the integration in a new economic geography of cities and the surrounding cities in a regional perspective. The need to look at the patrimony and the built environment in parts of equity and economic development. All these are certainly part of what should be and could be integrated in the new urban agenda. And we want to thank Mr. Oleg for this presentation. Let me move to the third speaker. I don't know if you have ever been in Medellín. Were you during the World Urban Forum? It's the city, you know, that was recognized as the most innovative city of the world. And for those that have been there, you will believe that despite the enormous challenge that the city has, it is true. And I'm very honored to present to you one of the brains that is behind this innovative, creative model of the city, which is Jorge Pérez Jaramillo, who is the Director of Planning of the City of Medellín.
Thank you. Thank you all for all of you, and it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for honor UN Habitat and to Barcelona also. I will ask you to look at my presentation during my speech because I want to talk especially about each image. So I will make some sentences through the presentation of the images that I like just to have it as a presentation of my city, as a show of the urban thing that means Medellín, and my ideas will focus on some of the main things that my city has done during recent years. Medellín is a good sample that cities are opportunities for the future. As Eduardo said, the last World Urban Forum held in Medellín last April was a show about our challenge, global challenge for equity in development, cities for life. We understand that the future of the cities are the future of the regions and the metropolitan areas, and they are claiming for a new governance around the world. Smart city thinking must be an optimistic strategy for the urban agenda. We strongly believe that the urban agenda is the human agenda. So let me talk about Medellín as a, as a city that means a process, a city in progress, a kind of urban laboratory in evolution, because Medellín has been a city that has understood that innovative knowledge using planning and urbanism as a social tool, as a toolbox in search for equity and for social inclusion has been successful. In our background, Medellín was a city that during the 20th century grew a lot. Urbanization and social and economic challenge became an inequity and exclusion expression of urbanization. During the 80s and 90s, Medellín was in a huge crisis and a very deep and complex crisis, and we had critical times. And we understood that the crisis was also an opportunity. Social, economical, political, and territorial crisis became a conflictive and a violent society. We created some instruments like the Presidential Council for Medellín to discuss what we called in the past alternatives for the future, trying to understand how the city could develop a shared agenda as an inspirational power to transform a crisis. And we were successful because we built the basis of a new leadership among our communities, a collective and long-term project that means diversity, participation, and shared vision. We used things like the planning tools. We developed strategic planning, territorial planning, development planning and sectorial planning, in many levels, in many sectors, to create the shared knowledge among our community to transform the situation. We developed a local democracy and a new agenda for governance in the municipality and in the metropolitan region, and we created political and administrative autonomy for the city. Citizens sharing goals, citizens working together in a cooperative way were the only chance that we had as a city to transform our reality. Through the cooperation between the public, private, academic, and social sectors, we created a municipal planning participatory system that now has bring us the chance to transform that crisis. Medellín means a resilient, democratic, and civic process through education, culture, leadership, and governance. We understand that a smart and innovative city is a smart city when we understand innovation as a social tool. We understand that innovation, it's not only about creation of technology or inventing things, but also using normal things in a new way. We understand that planning, urbanism, and public architecture with democratic shared leadership could be a political inspiration for equity. In search for equity through inclusion and social responsibility, for resilience and sustainability and the governance of the metropolitan regions, we understood that technology plus good management plus planning means governance and the power of local democratic things. In search for life for all, we have understand that the city are talking about the time of humanism. The new time of humanism means smart cities for life. Smart growth, urban growth means wealth for the people. Urban development is a strategy for life. So we understand that and we are working on that. Excuse me. So this is a show of projects that we have done in the past. And through planning, we have understood that exclusion can be controlled. This, in the image, you see what we have done for many years. And in white color, you see the places where the development hasn't grown. So we were growing upon the borders of the city. And that means exclusion to the limits. So we have developed the POT, which is the regional plan for the city, the master plan for the city. And the idea is to create both a municipal plan that deals with metropolitan issues, that integrates the city to the metropolitan region, but also a proposal for a compact city that means equality, inclusion, convivence, sustainability, and competitivity. So we define the strategies that will bring us the chance to create a long-term territorial general plans for the city until 2027, growing inside, transforming the way we use mobility for inclusion and for sustainable development. We have understood that the plan is also a way to create a group of master plans that we will develop in the future. So we are doing a new methodology for planning. We are combining traditional planning with urbanism and urban projects. So we have invited many groups of architects from abroad to participate in international competitions of urbanism. So, and this is the image of the winner of a huge competition that we invited last year for the transformation of the river parks. This used to be roadways, highways, and we are transforming the river into a park, a metropolitan park with underground ways to transform this reality through these master plans inside the river. So the plan itself, the master plan, the plan de ordenamiento territorial means macro proyectos like this. This is the innovation district, transformation of the traditional city town, the transformation of the transportation systems. We are combining multimodal systems to have metro, BRT, cables, and trams. And we are making new competitions like this for the city-town to transform the reality. Next week, we will receive the proposals for this area, which is more than 500 hectares area for the city hall competition, which is around this area, to transform through urban renewal processes all these sectors of the city. So we're working a lot with urbanism, with planning, as a tool for transformation of the life of the people. And finally, I would like to tell you about this project, which is very strategic, because in the past, the city has grown a lot to the borders. And the growth among the borders means exclusion and means environmental challenges and risks. So we are working also through these macro projects on the borders to transform this, to control the urban expansion, to create inclusive development, and to make more sustainable the future of these communities. So we're working about equity in development, cities for life, as the World Urban Forum proposed last April. We created a methodology for that, and we are sure that the only way our cities in the future can have opportunities for its own transformation, it's through a collective, participatory, democratic planning processes, but mainly through the creation of a shared vision for all. Thank you.
Thank you to Jorge for this presentation, which is obviously very inspiring. The city has been moving from fear to hope to life. And the new bit of the government is a new humanistic approach in which persons, citizens are at the center of development. And this development is integrated in a very clear and holistic manner, planning tools, with social tools, with political tools. And obviously this idea of inclusion has brought, for those that had visited the city in the slum areas, a lot of hope to expand the prosperity to all corners in the city. We can learn from Medellín, and many of the principles of this development should obviously be integrated in the new urban agenda. We would like now to open, do we have micros? Yes. To open for comments or questions from you to the panelists, or open questions. And we will have, I think, still 15, 20 minutes for that. So we are keeping the time very well. 10 minutes. Okay, 15. Please, you can go. There are micros. I don't see in the other side, but I see in this one. There are micros.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. I think it was really impressive. I especially appreciate the fact that you put spatial analysis, spatial dynamics, spatial movement of population at the center of what you are beginning to do. So, but I'm wondering, even I really like all the presentation, if there is perhaps there is something like a black hole, which is that now what are saying the expert for the population, they think that the speech of the expert have no value because it's very difficult to in Europe, in fact, and in other countries, to have something which comes from the top. And in Medellín, I really heard all what you have said. I really agree with that. But at the same time, you speak about competition. And I think in the world of collaboration, where we are now with distributed intelligence, how can you have the civil society and the project made with something like competition? How you can combine the two? How can perhaps you or we made a collaborative new urban goal for UN Habitat?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this question. Obviously, this is addressed to Jorge. He's going to respond. Perhaps we can take another one or two, and we will open a discussion with responses from the panelists. Who else would like to comment? No one. Then Jorge, please.
Well, let me explain you some details. We only use competitions for some particular projects, but in general, we use participatory processes, not only for the projects themselves, but the planning processes, because the municipal system of planning includes the obligation about participatory processes. We have to consult the communities through the planning processes. Recently, 2 weeks ago, we have approved the POT, the general plan. And we had more than 140 meetings, social meetings, this year for that, and the same last year. So we have to consult, we have to discuss everything with the communities. But they also have what we call local development plans, which are developed for zones. It's zonal planning inside the city, and it's participatory strategic planning. So we, as the technicians, or as the politicians that lead the project, have to work with the communities. So in the end, Medellín is the result, as I was trying to explain, of a social process, a collective project. Even though that means that someone has to take the decisions. And even though we understand that the role of the management of the mayor's house, its main role, we work together with the city.
Thank you. Any more questions? I would like just to add something. You can move to the micro and put in the list there. Okay, just to say that in UN Habitat we have developed the idea of competitive collaboration. Both are healthy, but they need to come together. We should avoid this neoliberal approach to only to competition, but to integrate the idea and to rebuild the notion of identity and collective work, but through a collaborative competition.
I'd also like to add that we're in a world where the exchange of information is a dialogue that goes two ways. And so we have expert knowledge that is used to teach and explain. We have local knowledge that is used to teach and explain. And somewhere in the middle, they meet. But unless we have the knowledges at our hands, we, as civil society, have a very hard time in coming up with really good suggestions and directions for what might happen. In the end, as we heard, someone has to make a decision, but it has to be an informed decision. And it's not the old-fashioned top-down, but it is collaboration, it's exchange of information, it's teaching and learning and listening. And in the end, there are probably some politics in this as well, but the point is that at least there's some knowledge there are knowledges on the table.
Thank you, Eugene. Please.
Okay, thank you very much. It's somehow weird for me to try to understand the situation just now, because we have heard 3 different ways of doing more or less the same thing. On the one hand, we have Medellín with the planning and structure that they have explained to us. On the other hand, we have St. Petersburg, which has a slightly different way of doing things. And then Eugenie has made us the favor to explain what we're looking for in the future for Habitat 3. So my question is, if just now we're understanding that are these 3 different ways of doing things, and we're looking for a new urban paradigm in Habitat 3, how could it be possible to try to join the two different ways of doing planning, parting from, on the one hand, from a completely different ways of governing and social structures in the case of Colombia, and in the case of St. Petersburg, that in this case are representing the rest of the world. So if we're trying to find a common urban paradigm for Habitat 3, how could it be possible to extract from these elements some guidelines that could serve for the rest of the planning? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That's a great question, Ishmael, and I think you've been part of a process to try to come up with those commonalities. The first thing we have to understand is that context matters. So what happens in Colombia doesn't stay in Colombia, it gets maybe traded to other places, but when it goes to other places, it's managed and tempered to that context. And the same thing in St. Petersburg. Those beautiful buildings in St. Petersburg and the way they've saved them and the problems they're dealing with, we will learn from them, but you don't just take these things and plunk them down in a place. But what we do have, and this is what I was referring to with Ismael, because he is a representative member of the steering committee of the World Urban Campaign, is we have created through the World Urban Campaign a series of statements or principles that really articulate what might be common and can be taken home to various places. These principles are articulated in a very simple document called The City We Need. It's a preliminary document. You can find it on the website of the World Urban Campaign. It's a very preliminary document because this is a document that we in civil society are going to use as we move forward towards the Habitat 3. In this are 9 principles at this point, talking about how the city we need is resilient, the city we need is equitable, the city we need provides public goods, the city we needs is representative, and so forth. There are 9 of them. But what these actually mean when you take them home will be defined by you in your homes.
Thank you. Maybe we can take the last question. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for a very insightful presentation. Mine, taking into consideration the evolution of the rapid urbanization, that by 2050 we'll have that number of people staying in various cities. How do we begin, in the context of a new urbanism, how do we begin to ensure that we don't exclude the poor? And how do you achieve spatial justice in a way that ensures resiliency, inclusivity, and prosperity for all? Because usually in terms of how other cities plan, they always marginalize the poor, and the poor are the ones who spend most of their income traveling to areas of opportunities for economic opportunities. And yet those are the people that need public transport, adequate public transport network. Those are the people that need economic opportunities. So how do we ensure integration in a way that actually achieves spatial justice? Thank you.
Thank you for this comment. I'm going to ask Mr. Oleg to respond to it. I just would like to say from UN Habitat perspective that the idea of integrating the poor, the excluded, the marginalized is a fundamental principle and connects to Ismael's comment before on which are the commonalities, which are the principles that are the beginning of the new urban agenda. I have the honor to write the first concept paper for the preparatory committee in New York for Habitat 3, and we call it the vectors of change that are needed before you address the new urban agenda. And obviously one of these vectors are the notion of human rights and inclusion and prosperity for all, fundamental principles. Mr. Oleg.
Я постараюсь ответить на все 3 вопроса сразу.
I'll try to answer all the 3 questions at the same time.
Вы спросили, что может быть черной дырой.
You asked about the black hole.
Черной дырой может быть то, что сказал второй, кто задал вопрос, не определиться с подходом.
The second person who asked the question already answered this question about the black hole. The black hole is undetermined approach.
И где-то зависнуть, как это говорят, между тем или другим.
Or when we stay in the middle of two different approaches and do not choose any one of them.
Потому что сколько мы не говорим полицентричность или градостроительная политика,
Because now we are speaking about polycentrical approach to
но ни то, ни другое не
town
может
planning.
быть, ни то, ни другое не может быть в отдельно взятом городе или регионе.
But we cannot apply this model in a standalone city or standalone region.
То есть это должно быть все-таки политикой государственной.
It must be the national policy.
И без этой концентрированной политики не может отдельно развиваться или быть градостроительная политика в регионе, в городе, в деревне и нигде.
Without this comprehensive national policy, we cannot assure good urbanistic policy of a standalone village or city.
И если ее не будет, то тогда те самые жилые огромные образования вокруг Москвы и Санкт-Петербурга как раз превратятся в маргинальные гетто.
And then if we do not have this policy, then these suburban areas of Moscow and St. Petersburg will be marginalized.
Это еще более важно, когда мы говорим о взаимодействии между регионами и муниципалитетами.
And it is even more important when we are speaking about the
Здесь,
relationship between regions and municipalities.
И здесь административные границы вообще не должны влиять на принятие градостроительных решений.
Because I think that administrative borders must not affect their decision-making process.
А это высшая степень доверия между муниципалитетами, что очень важно в принятии общих градостроительных решений.
There must be a high level of trust between different local authorities. It is very important to take decisions.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Eugenie, thank you to Oleg, thank you to Jorge, and most importantly, thank you to all of you for your participation. This is the beginning of an important discussion on the engagement towards Habitat 3. We hope you would participate more, and of course, the World Urban Campaign is an excellent platform to do so. Obviously, you can also contact us in Habitat. Thank you, and we will meet again.
Sì, sì.